Again, thanks very much for the invitation. I work for a business called RS Standards. We're a small consultancy. In a nutshell, we help develop better practices for responsibly sourced seafood supplied safely to markets. Our expertise is very much in seafood, aquaculture, fisheries, and seafood supply. With obviously the intention that this leads to improved livelihoods and benefits to communities, the people who produce those products as well. Some of the labels, the programs that we work with are listed there. Melanie, who presented earlier from Global Aquaculture Alliance, is indeed one of the programs that we support through technical support services, governance frameworks and things like this, and advice, and that's this Best Aquaculture Practices group of standards. And I'm just listing Udros Nguelta here in terms of some work we're just getting involved with clams, coordinated local aquaculture management systems. So, okay, global seaweed. First of all, I am no expert in seaweed compared to many of my colleagues and people probably sitting listening to this today. But what I'm going to try and do is just give a quick snapshot of global seafood and then move into particularly one of the key standards that may become important to seaweed production for demonstration of sustainability. So global seaweed is at around 32 million tons. It's taken from the latest FAO Sophia report. It is both farmed and harvested wild, but the vast majority of seaweed, 97% of all seaweed production, comes from farm sources, and most of that comes from East Asia and Southeast Asia. A number of species listed there: Saccharina, Undaria, Euchemia, and so on and so forth. And this is cultivated in lots of different types of systems, a lot of longline systems and raft systems, both nearshore and offshore systems. And just leading on from what Melanie said, actually, yeah, seaweed does have a potential for sequestering carbon and is now seen as something which could offer an opportunity with respect to adapting to climate change. Of course, it can have a potential to be overexploited as well in terms of over-harvesting and having consequential impacts on habitats and ecosystems. And this is particularly what I'm going to speak to you about in the next 15 minutes. Quick snapshot of global production then. I mentioned Southeast Asia. China by far is the largest producer, over 18.5 million tons, and followed by Indonesia next. And then you can see there's one or two other larger producers out in Southeast Asia, and then it tails off. This is just one frame of seaweed cultivation in the province of Fujian. This is out near Fuzhou. I was out there a couple of years ago. It is really quite colossal, the scale of seaweed farming out in Southeast Asia. It is quite impressive what they've done in seaweed cultivation, and those who've had the opportunity to visit will probably concur in that. And of course, that scale leads to large-scale industrial processing of seaweeds as well. Here's one example, Saccharina japonica, in terms of the scale of the processing there. So hundreds and hundreds of tons of seaweed are processed, on weekly basis. It's quite a labor-intensive industry, of course, in that part of the world. There's an opportunity to make it so, and from that, they produce a wide range of food products, and that's just one or two examples here. So in Ireland then, Ireland's, again, a long history of seaweed use, dates back well before the 18th century, but I've just put a marker down here in terms of seaweed kelp being used as ash and glass manufacturing, just to give you an understanding of the versatility of seaweed in terms of the broad range of products and different uses that it has. And yeah, simply as a source of iodine of days gone by. Of course, in more modern times, alginate extraction has been quite an interesting growing sector, and that's created applications in food and pharmaceutical, biomedical, even textile applications. And very close to home where you're sitting there, Aramara Cho, one of the founding seaweed businesses in Ireland back in 1947, began to utilize and recognize the huge potential and value of seaweed, the resource which exists off the west coast of Ireland. And of course, if managed carefully and harvested carefully, can be a resource into perpetuity for a long time. And because it is an indigenous natural resource, it's not going to go away if we look after it. So in terms of production, about 40,000 tons of seaweed is harvested annually. There's one example, a scophulum, one of the major seaweeds, which is produced, naturally grown on the west coast of Ireland, of course. And there's also a growing interest in research and development and pilot projects in farming seaweed here in Ireland as well, in different parts, both out in Connemara, Donegal, down in West Cork, closer to where I am, for different species, particularly some of the more valuable species, alaria, red seaweeds in other words, palmaria, and asexual porphyra. So yeah, an evolving industry, quite an interesting sector with lots of potential. Some idea of some of the seaweed products which have been produced. So yeah, everything from animal feed, soil conditioners, which are sold around the world, have great value and opportunity in agriculture. And again, Melanie alluded to this in terms of some of the potential that seaweed can show in other farming systems, and then all the way through to sort of like value-added products as well, in terms of consumer goods and also health and beauty products as well. And I've just put the website there for the seaweed site, which is a great resource here in Ireland for people who want to learn and understand a little bit more about the industry here, and also wider in terms of the international seaweed sector. So standards and certification. Okay, this is more my background. What are standards and certification? I think everybody will have familiarity here, but really standards define best practice. It's a way of bringing together a group of people to sit with a particular interest for a particular sector and define what is best practice or better practice for that particular sector, and thereby identifying the challenges. Now here today we're talking about environmental sustainability challenges perhaps, and to ensure better practice or good practice avoids the risks and impacts which we negate from those. Standards normally go beyond legal compliance, so standards usually try and step above that. However, they're voluntary in nature, and they use something called third-party certification to give independence, credibility to those producers, applicants which choose to accept and implement these voluntary standards. So basically, they derive their authority not from governments, not from regulations, but from the marketplace. So really, it's requiring a market interest in that particular standard or in that particular subject matter, that issue, that drives the incentive for people to look for products that have been certified to a particular standard or another. So today, I'm going to really talk and focus on this standard called the ASC/MSC Seaweed Algal Standard. It's relatively new, came out of the blocks in 2018, but I don't want to disregard or forget that there are standards which are in operation in Ireland, which operate to the EU organic regulation, and there's members in the seaweed community in Ireland which are certified to organic standards, and these are applied through Organic Trust, Irish Organic Association. Some may be using some of the German standards, natural and organic standards, and Ireland's got a particularly strong record and interest in organic certification, and it's served the purpose very well for both agriculture and aquaculture. So, Marine Stewardship Council and the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. So these two international not-for-profit programs, were developed. The MSC came together back in the 1990s in an initiative which was actually started by Unilever and WWF to promote sustainability in fisheries and thereby reverse overfishing and promote sustainable practices, and also tackle something called IUU, illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, which is still a challenge today. And similarly, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council were developed a little bit later, maybe 10 years ago, to look at developing responsible aquaculture practices and tackle what might be seen as unsustainable practices in aquaculture. So each of these these two non-profit programs developed international standards for sustainable fisheries and for responsible aquaculture, and they use something called an eco-label, a consumer-facing logo, to identify the products which are certified to those standards in the marketplace, and really very much by doing so to influence consumer behaviour towards them making better environmental choices and creating market demand for sustainable products. By doing so, encourage more fisheries, more aquaculture producers to adopt better practices and standards and become certified to these standards as recognition to that. So products that come from these sources are certified to these standards can gain access to use these eco labels that the MSC and the ASC promote. The MSC's blue label, just as a quick snapshot, is now on around 25,000 seafood products. So probably the most recognized sustainable label in seafood that's available today. That's not to say there aren't others available too, both in fisheries and aquaculture. The ASC standard there at the moment, there's around 1,400 farms which are certified to that standard. It's growing because there's always a number of farms, sometimes up to 100 or 200 farms in assessment at any point in time. So the MSC ASC seaweed standard, basically these two bodies came together to develop and collaborate on developing a sustainable seaweed standard. Because seaweed's recognised, of course, is coming from both wild and farmed environments, and also from both marine and freshwater as well. And it's grown in many different ways, different open systems and closed systems and land-based systems, as well as at sea. The standard that's been developed has incorporated something called the FAO Code of Conduct, Responsible Fishing and Aquaculture Guidelines, which set high-level requirements at an international level, which a lot of these types of standards have adopted and incorporated. And they follow something called ISEAL, which is the International Social and Environmental Alliance, and 17065 practices, which are really the standard norms for how to create and administer standards in a structured and credible way. So this standard, the ASC-MSC standard, is applicable to both macro and microalgae. So two quite distinct and separate types of way of producing seaweed, both in open ocean systems and land-based systems, and then perhaps in systems which could be many, many miles away from the sea. And in fact, the one you're looking at there in the bottom of the picture is in the middle of the US, so it couldn't really be further away from the sea, but use microalgae in bioreactors, closed fermentation systems to produce EPA and DHA. So these are businesses which are deriving nutrients which can be used for both agri and human consumption in new ways away from the marine environment. Pigments too as well, and this standard recognizes both of those. So what does the standard address? So key environmental and social impacts is the focus of this standard. So environmentally, it's saying seaweed operations must show they actively minimize their impacts on the natural environment. So in other words, the amount of seaweed that's harvested or farmed and the weights farmed shouldn't have a detrimental effect on the stock and also on the surrounding environment, the habitat, the ecosystem, other plants, flora and fauna in that natural environment. And socially too, there's a focus here. Seaweed operations must be managed in a responsible manner, and producers must care for their employees, work with the local community, and be good and conscientious neighbours. So a social dimension exists in this particular standard. It applies globally to all locations and all scales of seaweed operations. The standard, if you break it down a little bit, consists of 5 principles. Principle 1, maintaining wild populations. Principle 2, minimizing environmental impacts, as I mentioned. 3 is about effective management. In other words, management that assures that Principles 1 and 2 are maintained through time, and the management system, of course, can be a mixture between state government management systems as well as local management systems, the producers themselves, of course. Principle 4, promoting social responsibility, as I mentioned, and 5, strengthening community relations and interactions. So this standard really looks at these other dimensions around social components and around how these particular operations should be part of the community and should respond to community needs and should interact in a positive way with other users in these environments. Different production systems, so they range from completely wild harvesting, cropping of seaweed, of course, to systems which farm seaweed, but they collect the juveniles, if you wish, from the wild seed, to systems which do a mixture of both, and maybe some land-based facilities for the propagation of juveniles, all the way through to farming farming on land completely, as I mentioned, in these closed containment systems for microalgae. So when you're getting a little bit deeper into this standard, you start breaking it down into something called performance indicators. So each of those 5 principles has a number of performance indicators that are stacked underneath it, a total of 31 in total. And as you can see under principle 1, there's 3 performance indicators. Performance indicator 1.1 talks about stock status. Then it moves into harvest strategy, and then it looks at genetic impact on wild stocks, and of course, particularly where seaweed farming is undertaken, and it may be a non-native species. Principle 2, as I mentioned, looks at the components of the environment which may be impacted by the seaweed operation. So the habitat where seaweed exists, the ecosystem structure and function, ETP, endangered, threatened and protected species, other species in general. And then it looks at things like waste management and pollution control, pests and disease management, energy efficiency is included, and also translocations, where you may be taking seaweed from one particular region and then supplanting it in another region, and whether that has an impact on the ecosystem and surrounding environment as well. And principle 3 then into the legal framework around it, decision-making processes and compliance and enforcement. And principle 4 into all aspects of social responsibility, from child labour through to working hours, health and safety on operations, both farm and wild operations, as in wild harvesting operations. And as I mentioned, principle 5, community impacts, conflict resolution, rights of indigenous groups, and so on and so forth. I don't really have time to go through everything, of course, in detail. What I'm trying to do is just give you a flavour of the complexity and the range of the different performance indicators and criteria that are covered by the standard. And for any particular unit of assessment, and that's the particular focus, the scope of the assessment, it considers the species, the geographic region, the management system that is involved, the methods, whether it's farming methods or harvesting methods, the client group. In that sense relates to the people, those which are making the application, and that's derived eventually into something called a unit of certification. So the client group, the unit of assessment may consist, for example, it could be Ireland Inc., could be the unit of assessment. However, the unit of certification may be only elements of that. What I'm trying to say is that the assessment considers the entirety of the impact, even though there may be only elements who come forward with an interest to, let's say, take the risk and become assessed to this particular standard. Assessment is based on scoring. So it's like taking an exam. There's a minimum level, a conditional pass that has to be achieved if that particular client group is to be awarded certification, and there's a target level of full pass as well. If you fall below the minimum, there's something called a critical condition that's raised. A critical condition means that you don't pass until that critical condition is fixed. If you hit the minimum level and you receive a conditional pass, it's sort of like saying that you have to take some improvements, but you could still potentially pass the certification audit, so long as you don't pass the threshold of how many of those conditional passes can be included. And it ranges between 6 to 8, depending on what type of assessment it is, wild harvesting, up to that microalgae cultivation I mentioned, and all the different processes in between, or different ways of producing seaweed in between that. So yeah, conditional passes require something called a client action plan and a timeline to be developed by the client, and that's checked on an annual basis by the assessment team from the certification body. Then again, I'm digging in even a little bit deeper than previously. So if we looked at just one of these performance indicators, and I'm just taking the first one, stock status. The stock status is then broken down into a scoring issue. So the stock status relative to irreversible impact is the key measurement that's taken. And there's a minimum requirement that has to be achieved. And the available information indicates in this sense that the wild stock is above the point where the harvesting impact will be irreversible or very slowly irreversible. And a target really what you want to achieve is something called MSY. So you really want to ensure that when you're harvesting seaweed, you're doing it not beyond the capacity for the seaweed to self-rejuvenate to its maximum sustainable yield. And not to sort of give a lecture here because it would take too long. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side here, you can see that on the bottom, we've got F, which is fishing effort, and on the left, on the up axis, it's catch. So if you can imagine, as you increase your fishing effort, you catch more fish, or you harvest more seaweed in this sense. To a certain point, you hit something called maximum sustainable yield, where no matter how much effort you put in, you've surpassed the ability for that particular stock to sustain itself at that maximum level. So the way that it sustained itself is below its maximum level, and so you do not catch anymore. You end up catching less, and that's something called overfishing. And eventually you surpass a mark where it's not just overfishing, but your stock is hitting something called an overfish status. So in simple sense, we want to be here and we don't want to be here in any type of fishery. Now, that's easy to say. To collect the data and to do these analyses for any fishery stock is quite expensive. And of course, there's agencies such as the Marine Institute here in Ireland who dedicate their time and have a lot of professional staff, a lot of competence around doing this for any particular stock, to gather sufficient information to be able to do these stock assessments and be able to predict at any point in time what is a sustainable level of F and what the catch does that relate to. And that's something called setting quotas. Now, the same principles apply in this standard to seaweed, but however, doing that is quite challenging. And so what this standard allows is something called proxies or surrogates. So these are measurable alternatives to determine a safe harvest level without the necessity to collect all that data which we might have for these larger international stocks, the herrings, the mackerels, the gadoids, the whitefish of the world. And so one area you could look at for this is look at the biological characteristics of the species, because this is often well understood. If you know, for example, your species and you know it can recover and regrow, such as a scophulum, for example, Gracilaria, then you could potentially create an estimate of the biomass needed to allow that population to regrow. So how much of those particular plants do you need to leave intact to allow them to regrow? And that thereby you set something called a proxy for MSY, and that could be something that's numerically defined as the amount of kilos per meter squared biomass, in other words, of seaweed that's left behind after harvesting. And of course, your species may be different. Lessonia, for example, whereby it wouldn't recover if it's cut. So ideally, you'd collect the entire individual. But then you need to think about leaving some individuals intact. And again, it comes down to numbers. How many individuals should be left intact to allow MSY to be sustained and that population to grow? So you can see how, fairly straightforward proxies can be created for seaweed. And indeed, this is what's happening in a lot of seaweed cultivation areas already. And surveys are done in this manner and so on and so forth anyway.
Yeah, we've got 1 minute left, more or less.
Right. As you get less and less information, you can move to something called this risk-based framework. And that's more of a semi-qualitative quantitative tool, which allows you to assess risk. It gets quite complicated, but Bailey, you're looking at something called productivity attributes. You're trying to, again, look at the biology of the species and consider how fast it grows, where it grows, and then you look at its susceptibility to harvesting, encounterability, selectivity of how it's harvested. And this can be applied to some of these performance indicators as well, to get a risk profile, if you wish, and a score. And basically, an assessment team, when it's measuring a seaweed cultivation unit or seaweed harvesting operation, would run through each of these performance indicators in this manner. And as you can see, it takes quite a long time to do so. assessment steps, there is a structure of how assessment's done, and some key points are pulled out. Pre-assessment, we would advise. Pre-assessment is a snapshot. It allows a potential client to come forward and say, let's take a look at this in a smaller sense without entering the main assessment, and get an understanding of where we fit, what are the obstacles, do we have sufficient data, do we meet the circumstances, if you wish, of this particular standard. We would advise that someone from that operation project manages it, because it is quite a complex piece of work. There's a lot of stakeholder input required in these assessments as well, and it's a requirement of the MSc and ASC to have public comment and public input into these particular assessments. So public comment periods are an important part of it, and the assessment team is obliged to respond, and the client's obliged to respond to those public comments. If you're successful, you can do something called chain of custody certification, and this is really just ensuring that the seaweed which is harvested from those sites indeed is the seaweed that eventually ends up packed on consumer shelves or as a business-to-business product and is identified with one of these labels in the marketplace. And that's really a smaller assessment around traceability. So recognition of eco-labels. So is it worth doing? What's the value opportunity? Well, the MSc undertake research all the time, and ASC do as well, and they usually employ GlobeScan to do this. It's a leading research agency to take a look at the marketplace. The last one in 2018, they involved 25,000 consumers in survey work. And this is just some of the results. 83% of seafood consumers agree that we need to protect seafood. And I think it's understood that, let's say, labeling in terms of green credentials, as long as it's not greenwashing, of course, is important to consumers today. 72% of those surveys said that an independent verification of sustainability was important. So rather than the brand itself making the claim, having a level of independence around that. 74% people said who love seafood recognize the MSc label. So there's a certain amount of recognition, and I guess it's on around 25,000 products now, so it is becoming noted in the marketplace. So finally, takeaway messages, and thanks to Perseverance Mihal. So yeah, there are sustainable, responsible standards available for seaweed, and of course there's the organic standard as well, which is being used. Organic, more of a niche perhaps use, but still important, I think, for seaweed and as serve purpose in Ireland. This particular standard, ASC, MSc, I've run through, sets environmental and social criteria. I can't stress enough that it requires data and information, quite a lot of data and information to get through one of these assessments. But does it offer an opportunity? Certainly, as we just said, market is receptive to green and sustainable foods in general. So I think it potentially does. And the MSc is widely recognised, as I've mentioned as well. Thank you very much, Mihal.
Great, Dave, thank you very much. That was really interesting, well done. And I think it is very relevant to the conversations. A guy called Shay has put in a few questions about, we'll say, the technical aspects of it, but just maybe to start a little bit broader for a minute, the question is very simple. Do you think that this particular seaweed standard would be applicable and would be a good idea for a leading Irish company that has taken over Aramara, in other words, Acadia? And I say that because if you think of the earlier conversations we had today with Melanie about, public acceptance of aquaculture, or with Val Cummins about the public acceptance of offshore renewables and so on, public support is crucial. And I think everyone involved in this cluster can see there's challenges around that for aquaculture. Given that seaweed is at an earlier stage of its evolution, Dave, should they invest early in this? And specifically, as a market leader, do you recommend that a company like Acadia do that? Thank you.
I think yes. I think using these types of tools can be important in terms of getting the messages across to concerned groups and interested parties, and also by having sort of like the integrity of an independent assessment, I think it supports that message as well. These standards are not just MSc and ASC in isolation. Other standards in aquaculture, Global Aquaculture Alliance, where Melanie comes from, they have a level of independence, integrity, and also around them all, they have boards of fairly highly influential groups, communities, environmental organizations, which, if you wish, can be sort of like pointed to say that, we're part of this family, so to speak. We've been recognized, endorsed, we passed these tests. Look who the endorsers of these particular programs are, to gain some trust in terms of what these operations are doing, in the marketplace, and generally, I think in our own environments, in the communities where seaweed producers exist and grow and harvest as well. And it is true there are concerns, and there are lots of dynamics around interests and user groups within these areas. And I think always having standards is a good thing to demonstrate that you're following what is considered to be best practice at this point in time. So absolutely, yeah.
Just one more question. It's from Paula Casey, and I suppose it follows on that discussion just now. Should the existing, we'll call them traditional seaweed harvesters, be considered an indigenous group, was the phrase he used, or could a standard like this help the government in Ireland in terms of the governance? This sector, as you well know, Dave, seaweed, is in a kind of transition from being a wild to being more a managed and commercial sector, with aquaculture becoming more a part of it. So I think that this kind of standard can help in policy terms, but would you see specifically the folks who are involved at the moment in the wild seaweed sector being taken into account in setting a standard for what's been done? Thanks.
I think that this standard would be applicable to their needs as it stands at this point in time. It's vital that they're included. It won't work unless they are included and brought along that journey, if you wish, and buy into it and agree with that in that sense. I think it's important. And again, even leaving the market aside, even just looking at saying, well, you use a standard, to inform policy, to benchmark what might be considered as good practice, I think always is a good thing as well. So even if you don't look at the value of it in the marketplace, just looking at internal with the stakeholders, managers involved in seaweed, and as you said, there's sort of like the move from what has been sort of like a very traditional sector, and I think it still can be a traditional sector. There's no reason why tradition isn't part of this moving forward. It's just that there's more, I think, recognition of that, more tangibility around what it's doing, and that information is brought forward, and by doing so, develop transparency, develop trust, develop buying into the sector. I think it's quite important, yeah.
Great, thanks very much, Gramil, Dave, and I know that you're going to be working with Cliona and the folks in the Seaweed Grow project here, and the best of luck with that. And I think that's a dialogue that needs to continue, and we'd very much endorse what you've been saying in the last few minutes.